Welcome again, everyone. My name's Ed Holloway, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Macular Society. And you're very, very welcome to this special My Macular and Me webinar, joined by two people from our research team. So tonight's webinar is all about clinical trials, which, as you'll all know, I'm sure, are a really crucial step in the development of new treatments for macular disease. And tonight we're going to be exploring what clinical trials are, the different types or stages of clinical trials, why they're carried out, and why they're such an important part of progressing medical research. We know many people are eager to access new treatments through trial participation, so we'll also be sharing insights into some key trials currently underway, how to find out more, and how to get involved. And as always, we've got a short talk from our speakers, but then lots of opportunity for questions and discussions. So any questions that you have, please do add them to the chat and we'll go through as many as we can. But now I'm going to hand over to our speakers tonight, who are Geraldine Hoad and Sarah Clinton, who join us from the Macular Society research team, and they'll be guiding us through this topic. So now I'll hand over to Geraldine and Sarah. Over to you both.
Thank you, Ed. Nice to be here today. Sarah's going to start and then I will take over. Over to you, Sarah.
Yes, let me just share my screen. Can everyone see my screen okay? Or is it?
Yes, but your notes are visible.
Notes view, okay. Let me try again. It's always...
Yeah, it always takes a couple of goes, doesn't it?
Is that better?
That's better. Perfect, thank you.
And if I do that, is that still showing full screen?
Yep, that's full screen.
Thank you. So yes, as Ed said, we'll be talking a bit about clinical trials, what clinical trials are, different types of clinical trials, and then what trials are available right now in the UK and elsewhere, and how you can get involved. So there are many different types of clinical trials, and the most common or widely known area of clinical research are clinical trials. These test new treatments or interventions, typically against placebo and standard care. And I'll talk a bit about what that means in the next slide. As well as testing new treatments, clinical trials can also test new care pathways to improve care. Ophthalmology is one of the busiest departments in the NHS. So there's a lot of research going on to try to find new ways to streamline and improve care, improve diagnosis or treatment, especially with the rise of technologies such as artificial intelligence. This is a really promising area of research. As well as clinical trials, we also have studies referred to as observational studies. So these typically observe people over many years, looking at how and why disease develops and progresses. So this is often really important for rare conditions where less is known of how and why disease progresses, such as in macular disease and other macular dystrophies, but also with progressive conditions like age-related macular degeneration. AMD progresses from early to intermediate and late stage AMD. So observing who progresses faster, why people progress faster, can really help us understand the disease and hopefully then find new treatments. So through these observational studies, we're able to find new areas of research for treatments and to help design future clinical trials. Finally, a really important area of clinical research, which is focus groups and surveys. So it's really important that we hear directly from people living with a condition to understand their experience and their hopes for future treatments. So this could be shaping research and trial design to ensure that any future treatments that are being developed are targeting what patients really care about. So at this point, companies spending years and years on developing a treatment if it's not what patients want. So making sure that we're targeting the aspects of care people are really interested in can be really important. But what are clinical trials? It's what we'll mostly be focusing on today. So clinical trials are really important studies to test whether new treatments are safe and effective. And these clinical trials need to be done to prove to approval bodies that treatment should be given to patients. Clinical trials can test a variety of different interventions. So they may test drugs such as oral tablets and injections, as well as many other different types of drugs. But it can also include surgical and non-surgical treatments, as well as technologies. And trials don't always have to be testing new treatments. They can also be testing new tools to help improve quality of life. In clinical trials, treatments are typically tested against placebo or any available treatments. This tests and compares how well they work. So for trials where there's already an approved treatment, trials will typically be compared against standard care, which compares whether the new treatment is better or as good as the treatments currently available. So we can then test whether this new drug is, you then use this to compare how well different drugs work against each other. However, if we don't have a standard care or a treatment already available, this is when we use a control arm where some participants may receive a placebo or sham treatment. This is because there's something called the placebo effect, where people may experience improvement in symptoms when taking a treatment, even if that treatment is a sham or a fake treatment, such as a sugar pill. So this placebo group allows researchers to be sure that any changes that are seen in participants are due to the treatment rather than the placebo effect. And then finally, we often get asked whether clinical trials are safe. And it's safe to take part in clinical trials. And any possible new treatments that start in clinical trials have to go through rigorous laboratory testing to ensure that they are safe for humans. So these treatments can be going through years of preclinical testing to ensure that any side effects are not harmful to those who are taking part in the clinical trial. So there are a number of phases a clinical trial will go through, and they will have to go through all phases of these clinical trials in order to be approved. And these phases, clinical trials get larger and more thorough as they advance. Not every treatment will make it through all phases, all three phases. If the results for a previous trial are unsuccessful, companies may decide not to move forward with research into that treatment. So starting off with phase 1 trials, these are typically small studies ensuring that a treatment is safe. So the researchers will be looking to see if treatment causes any side effects, and if so, how severe these side effects are. If that phase 1 trial looks to be successful, the treatment may move into phase 2 trials. These are larger than the phase 1 trials, and looking to investigate safety and efficacy of the treatment. So really looking to see if the treatment works, how well it works, and checking that no new side effects appear when we're testing this new treatment in a larger group of people. Finally, with reach phase 3 trials, which are the final stage, the treatment needs to go through before approval. And typically there'll be 2 phase 3 trials running, often at the same time. These are large, often global studies that ensure that the treatment is effective in a large and diverse population. If these phase 3 trials are successful, the companies who create that treatment will look to get approval. In the UK, this is through the MHRA, which is the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, and they approve based on safety and efficacy. They also have to go through NICE, which is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, looking at safety, efficacy, and also cost effectiveness for a treatment to be given on the NHS. Both Scotland and Wales have their own approval bodies, which is the Scottish Medicines Consortium and the All Wales Medicine Strategy Group. So there is slightly different approvals based on where you live in the UK, and different approval bodies for the rest of the world as well. So we've been talking about clinical trials, but why take part in a clinical trial? Taking part gives you early access to the latest treatments and drugs. However, it's important to be aware that there's no guarantee that the treatment will be successful, or that you will be given, be put into the treatment arm. There's a chance that you may be given placebo or the standard care, and oftentimes you may not know which treatment you've been given until after the trial has ended. This is to make sure that knowing what treatment you're on doesn't affect the results. Taking part in a clinical trial can also help support research into macular disease and to find new treatments. Every trial, whether it's successful or not, helps us to learn more about macular disease. It brings us closer to finding these new treatments. It can also allow you to take an active role in your care, to understand your condition and to get more frequent monitoring. So with clinical trials, you may often be visiting the trial site or a hospital more frequently than you would otherwise. You may also be getting more frequent monitoring and treatment. And this can be very reassuring for some people, especially if they're not already getting monitoring already. Finally, taking part in clinical trials ensures that the patient's point of view is heard when research is being planned and carried out and reported. So that patient's point of view is heard throughout the process. So if you are interested in taking part in a clinical trial, what's that process of joining? So if you decide to volunteer for a clinical trial, you'll typically have to go through some screening tests and questions. So most trials have a very strict criteria of who's suitable to join a trial. This is to ensure that anyone who's joined the trial, they will have a very similar level of disease, and that level of disease has been tested and they believe that that treatment may be useful. It's also important that some other criteria are met, such as not having any other conditions that might rule you out from being part of the trial. Each clinical trial is very different with the amount of times you might have to go for treatment or monitoring. So there will be time to speak to research staff who are involved in the trial, who are able to answer any queries and explain more about the trial, what's involved and what's expected of you if you decide to join. So this needs to be done. There needs to be time for you to ask any questions and really find out more. This is referred to as consenting, and you'll go through often a patient information sheet detailing everything that's involved. So you'll be able to discuss with family members and friends before deciding whether you would like to take part in that clinical trial. It's really important to be aware that there should be no pressure to join a clinical trial. At any point you are able to remove yourself, or you may decide that you don't wish to continue, and there should and the staff involved should be very understanding of that. So now I've talked a bit about what clinical trials are, what it's like to take part. I'll let Geraldine speak more about the clinical trials that are currently available for macular disease in the UK and elsewhere.
Sarah. Yes, so I'm in this part of the talk, I'm going to be highlighting just a snapshot of some of the clinical trials underway for macular diseases, both for wet and dry AMD, for macular dystrophies, for some surgical treatments, and then some of the trials looking to improve care pathways. So I'm going to start off with drug trials for dry AMD, and these drug trials are focusing on late stage dry AMD, otherwise termed geographic atrophy. So the first couple of trials I'm going to highlight are oral treatments, oral tablets, once a day oral tablets for geographic atrophy. There's a couple reached phase 3. So the last stage of clinical trials. The drug names are tinlarebant and gilduretinol. Now, drug trials often have a long title, but they also have a short one-word title. So the two drugs being treated here in trials is the Phoenix trial and the Saga trial. And you'll see that many of these trials have this single name that they're used as a shorthand to refer to. And then also I've shown the company running the trial who's developed the drug. So in this case, it's Belite Bio for tinlarebant and Alkeus Pharmaceuticals for gilduretinol. So that is important. If you want to know more about these trials, I don't have time to give a lot of detail, but the companies have details about all these trials and the drug on their websites. So that's always a good place to look if you want to know more. So these two trials are exciting. You know, we may one day have an oral treatment, a once-a-day tablet for geographic atrophy to slow the progression of the disease. So other forms of treatment in clinical trials there's a skin injection being developed, a once-a-day skin injection that I imagine you would be able to give yourself at home. And the drug is called elameprotide, and the trial is called Renew from Stealth Biotherapeutics. So a different way of administering a drug by a skin injection. Another one is what are sort of most familiar eye injections or intravitreal injections. And there's a drug being developed in the Archer and being tested in the Archer 2 trial from Annexon Biosciences. And this is a treatment which is what we call a complement inhibitor. So this is a drug that would reduce the inflammation that causes the damage in geographic atrophy and contributes to the damage. And so that's the different approach being taken for that trial. And lastly, there's a gene therapy trial of OCU 410. That one doesn't have a name, it's just got a number. And the Amada trial by a company called Ocugen. And in this case, with the gene therapy, we're talking about enabling the cells of the eye to make the drug themselves, rather than having to take a tablet or have an injection. The treatment delivers the recipe for making the drug to the cells of the eye, and then the cells of the eye can make the drug themselves. So that offers the potential for a one-off treatment, which continuously would treat the disease thereafter. And we've got that one in development for dry AMD. Next slide, please, Sarah. Thank you. So that was dry AMD, geographic atrophy. You'll be familiar with the treatments we currently have for wet AMD. We now have a suite of drugs, all intravitreal injections. So the emphasis with wet AMD treatment in the future is reducing the burden of treatment on patients, less regular injections, other ways of reducing the amount of time people have to devote to going to hospital and having the treatment. So couple of gene therapies are in treatment in the Ascent and the Artemis trials. And similar to the dry AMD gene therapy, it is about enabling the cells of the eye to make the drug themselves rather than needing regular injections. So in these trials, they are testing this one-off injection into the eye, and it's looking promising. People have needed far fewer treatments due to this one-off gene therapy. So in terms of sustained release of drugs into the eye, that's another way of extending the time between treatments. And there's a couple of drugs, axitinib and vorolanib, which are being tested at the moment. And so the axitinib, it delivers the drug not into the vitreous, the jelly-like substance in the center of the eye that you're familiar with from wet AMD injections. It's going to deliver this drug into between the layers of the retina, and that will hold the drug close to where it's needed in the macula, and it's another way of potentially extending the time between treatments. And the vorolanib is a biodegradable insert injected into the center of the eye, which then gradually releases the drug over time, and you may only need that treatment every 6 months. So that's another approach. And the last one on this slide is the BETTER trial from Misana Therapeutics. And this is quite a different approach. In wet AMD, there's a process called fibrosis or scarring that can take place. Despite the anti-VEGF drugs working reasonably well to control the disease, a certain level of damage can build up over time. And this may be called scarring or fibrosis that may be mentioned to people in clinics. Unfortunately, we don't have any treatments to prevent or to deal with this scarring, and it will affect vision, and there's nothing that can be done about it at the moment. So it's really exciting to see a drug being developed that would prevent that fibrosis potentially, and would therefore reduce the amount of sight loss even when you're being treated for wet AMD. So that's exciting to see a fibrotic drug, anti-fibrotic drug being developed. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of other macular conditions, I wanted to highlight some treatments in development for Stargardt disease and Best disease, and then also a surgical intervention for macular hemorrhage. So for Stargardt disease, we're seeing some really exciting developments in terms of treatments. You may recognise tinlarebant and gilduretinol are listed here in the DRAGON and the TEASE trials. So these two drugs, oral tablets, are being tested for both Stargardt disease and for dry AMD, geographic atrophy. The processes of the two diseases are quite similar, and there are several other things I've not had time to list, which are being tested in both Stargardt disease and dry AMD. So the potential for a treatment for Stargardt disease, it does look like it might be on the horizon, fingers crossed. The other one listed there is the SB007 and the ASTRA trial from a company called Splice Bio. So this is a gene therapy approach, and that's being tested. It's really quite at early stages of that trial, gene therapy approach. There's an early stage trial for Best disease of a drug called Ravicti, and it's the BETTER trial, and that's actually been conducted at Manchester University NHS Trust. It's really early stages, and Ravicti is an approved drug for other conditions, not eye conditions, and they think that it may work for Best disease. So that's really exciting. I don't think there's any other trials underway for Best disease. It's hoped that it will address the problem for it's the problem with Best disease, which is to do with the protein that is coded for by the Best gene, and it's hoped that it would restore the function of that protein, because the mutation that people have with Best disease leads to a protein that doesn't work properly. So this Ravicti would hopefully enable that drug to work, that protein to work properly, and therefore act as a cure for the disease. So really nice to see that one happening in Manchester. And finally, the macular hemorrhage trial. So this is a surgical intervention for people who experience macular hemorrhage, sort of a bleed within the retina, which is a really serious aspect of wet AMD. And so the TIGER trial is being undertaken at King's College in London, and also it's a European trial, so there's sites in Europe as well. And that's testing to see whether the clot that develops as a result of the hemorrhage can be removed by injection of a clot busting drug. And if they can show that this clot busting drug and the approach being taken in that trial is better than the current treatment, which is anti-VEGF injections, then that would be could be adopted as a standard treatment on the NHS. So that's underway, and people are being offered either the normal treatment, standard care, or this new type of treatment for macular hemorrhage. So other types of trials, which are not drug trials, as Sarah mentioned, can be around improving care pathways, so how people are treated within the NHS, generally speaking. So this isn't about drugs or anything, this is just about how people are treated and improving that and making it more efficient, for instance, or improving outcomes for patients in other ways. So I've got 3 trials here I'm going to mention: the Hermes, Fenetra and Dorado trials, all undertaken in the UK. Hermes and Fenetra managed through Moorfields Eye Hospital in London, and Dorado managed in York. Now, the Hermes trial was all about whether they can improve the referrals into hospitals that are made by opticians when they can see a problem at the back of the eye and they think there's an issue and they want to refer you into the hospital. A significant number of the referrals that take place now are found to be unnecessary, sort of false referrals, and that's taking up clinic time in hospitals that could be better used for treating patients who need treatment. And this is, the idea was that the optician take the scans using the OCT machines that most opticians have these days. Those OCT scans would be sent into the hospital, be reviewed by the ophthalmologist at the hospital, and then they would decide whether a referral into the hospital was really necessary for that person, cutting down on unnecessary referrals, unnecessary hospital appointments, and freeing up hospital clinic appointments for the people who really need the referrals and need treatment. We all know how really busy eye clinics are, and it would be great if those referrals could be optimized. So that has just finished, but isn't quite ready to report yet on the outcome of that. So it's really important that there's that evidence that can be presented to the NHS to support changes in how patients are managed. So the Fenetra trial was about community-based monitoring of patients with stable wet AMD. So those who are treated for wet AMD may at some point no longer need further treatment. They are regarding as being stable, but they still need monitoring because their wet AMD may recur and they may need more treatment. And so instead of people being treated, being monitored at the hospital, maybe they could be monitored on the high street at the opticians through an OCT scan, for instance. So this was about whether proving that this system could work, that stable wet AMD patients could be quite happily monitored through the opticians on the high street. That's coming to an end and we'll report soon. And as again, we'll provide proof to the NHS that hopefully that this would be a system that would work. The Dorado trial is underway, and it's about community-based early detection of wet AMD. So it's really about screening people who are at risk of developing wet AMD. So there may be an early or intermediate stage in their AMD, at risk of progressing to late stage AMD and wet AMD, which would would need treatment very quickly. We know how important it is that when you develop wet AMD, that you get that treatment, you get the diagnosis and the treatment as quickly as possible. So this is about seeing whether early screening of people with wet AMD would be beneficial to the patients and cost effective and so on. So the other one I wanted to highlight was a trial that's actually being funded by the Macular Society. It's called STOMP. And this is all about supporting young people and teenagers who have macular dystrophies like Stargardt disease, and creating a integrated support package for those people who are young people who are starting to experience sight loss, starting to be impacted by their condition, and how we can support them through education, through visual aids, through counselling maybe. So creating an integrated support package, really, it involves talking to these young people, seeing what they want, what they need, and designing a package of support. And that one's being undertaken at Moorfields Eye Hospital. And we're very pleased to be able to support that trial. So Sarah talked about not just trials of treatments or interventions, as they're sometimes called, but observational studies. And this is where the people enrolled on the trial are monitored over a period of time, probably years. Various tests done on them every time they go into the hospital, and therefore we learn about the progression of their disease. And with AMD, we know that people progress at very different rates. Some people never get beyond early or intermediate AMD, and other people progress quickly to the late stage. And we really love to know why that is, to really understand more about the progression of the disease, to identify those people at high risk of progression to late stage AMD and sight loss, so that they can be monitored more closely. And so we pick up, for instance, when they develop wet AMD and get them in for treatment as soon as possible. So the Pinnacle and the Summit trials are all about predicting progression of intermediate AMD to late stage AMD. The Pinnacle was the first one, and it's a large 5-year study funded by the Wellcome Trust, several £million. And that was progressing really well and was coming towards the end. And they've been monitoring people for 3 years, people with intermediate AMD. And it was thought, well, 3 years, wouldn't 5 years be even better? Could we extend the Pinnacle study so that we carry on monitoring people for another couple of years with a slowly progressing disease? The longer we follow people for, the more information we'll get, the better the information we'll get. And so the leader of the trial, Professor Andrew Lotary from Southampton, came to the Macular Society and asked us if we'd support an extension to the Pinnacle trial, which is called Summit, but it's essentially following straight on from Pinnacle. So we are supporting the extension, as I said, which is called Summit, in association with the pharmaceutical company Roche, which funding that 50%. And we're really proud to be involved in such a really important study, because there's lots of outcomes of this study, but one of them will be around possibly being able to predict the progression of people's disease. Many people come to us and say, well, I want to know, how long before I can't drive anymore, for instance. And that may be something that comes out of this, that we can predict the progression of the disease on an individual basis, based on what we know about how the disease progresses generally. So that's really excited and very proud to be supporting such an important trial. The other one I wanted to highlight was Polaris, which is an observational trial of people who have Stargardt disease and how that progresses over time. This is being supported by a company called Splice Bio, who I mentioned earlier, who are developing a treatment for Stargardt disease, a gene therapy. So they really want to learn more about the progression of Stargardt disease, and that will help with understanding the disease better, designing clinical trials for their treatment better, but also those joining the Polaris observational study have the potential that they may be chosen to be on one of the treatment trials, one of the interventional trials to test the treatment. So that can be another benefit of being on something like an observational trial. You're not actually getting a treatment, but you might get sort of priority access to a treatment when it reaches that stage. So those are a couple of examples of observational studies and the importance of them. So I just wanted to finish off because some of you may be thinking, how do I take part in clinical trials? How do I find out about what clinical trials are underway and the details and volunteer myself? So the Macular Society for about 10 years has had our research participant database. And that can be is a really useful resource for people who want to take part in clinical trials or surveys or be part of focus groups or take part in research in any way, really. It's quite simple to sign up to this research database. Members receive a paper form in their packs, or we can send out a paper form to people, or you can access a website form and sign up. It's quite a simple form. We don't ask for a great deal of information. What's really important to us is your diagnosis, where you live and so forth, your age, so that we then can search the database for people who might be eligible for clinical trials that we are approached to help recruit for. If you don't want to be on the database, we advertise trials through various means or other opportunities like surveys or focus groups. We might advertise them on the website, through our e-newsletter, through Sideview magazine. But if you're on the research database, we can particularly target you for information about clinical trials and other forms of research. We would just provide you with information, and we don't provide your details to anybody else. We provide you with information, and then if you're interested in volunteering, then you can get in contact with the researchers yourself and volunteer that way and find out more. So that's a really useful resource that we're hoping to expand in the future. There is a website called Be Part of Research, which is a great resource. So that's run by the National Institute for Health Research, which is part of the NHS. This Be Part of Research lists all the trials underway in the UK. It's fairly user-friendly, and you can look on there and search by location or by condition. I suggest you just put in macular into the search function, and it will come up with a list of trials which are underway, and then you can narrow that down as to whether they're recruiting or not. And it gives you details of this trial. It allows you to access the researchers taking part in the trial. It's a really useful resource, and it's regularly kept up to date. But you also may want to talk to your local hospital. If you could go have regularly appointments at your ophthalmology clinic, and if your hospital is one of the larger ones, because not all hospitals take part in research trials, but the larger, particularly the teaching hospitals, will be active in research. And it may be worth talking to your ophthalmologist, talking to the research nurses about what trials they may have underway, because when a trial is being carried out by a hospital, they will be looking to recruit from the people who attend their clinics. They will have all the data that they need to know whether you're suitable for a trial or not. But it's always, you may want to just have a chat with them about what trials they have underway, and flag that you are interested in taking part in a clinical trial. So research in the UK is really active and across the world, and I hope this has just given you a flavour of what's going on out there. There is a great deal of research going on out there. I've got a big spreadsheet that we try and keep up to date with all the research that's going on all over the world, and it's just getting bigger and bigger. So hopefully that's given you a flavour, and very happy to answer questions between us, Sarah and I.
Thank you so much, Geraldine and Sarah. Really, really interesting talk. And I'm fascinated by research. As you know, earlier on in my career, I did a very similar job to Geraldine. And it's just great having the team as part of our organisation with the depth of knowledge that you have. And thank you for sharing it with us tonight. So we've had lots of questions. We've got some general questions about clinical trials and how they work, but also some specific ones about kind of specific bits of research which are underway. I'm going to start with one of the general ones. Who approves clinical trials, and is ethical approval given for each clinical trial?
Sarah?
I think so. Approval does need to be given for clinical trial start, especially if it's happening in an NHS hospital. There will be approval through that. But typically, as it's been done by pharmaceutical companies, they'll be deciding where they're putting sites, and the ethical approval will be done, I think, per site. Geraldine, you want to?
I think it's the MHRA that have to approve all clinical trials. So they would approve that it would take place, and then the hospital will also make sure that the hospital is sort of able to carry out the trial. So there's a level of hospital approval as well. And all trials have to go through a research ethics committee to ensure that they are safe and are managed properly.
And one of the things those committees look at really carefully is all the information that's given to potential participants, just to make sure everyone, understands the risks and the benefits, potential benefits of participating. Now got some more sort of specific questions. A couple of linked ones. So is there research for people who have genes for macular degeneration, but they're still young and their vision has no issues? Could research help in the prevention of disease? Is that something that's being explored?
Well, if you know that something like Stargardt disease runs in your family, you may want to access a genetic diagnosis. Certainly where something like Stargardt's or Best disease is identified in an older child, they may want to screen the younger child to see if they've both got the same mutation. So yes, certainly that we know I'm thinking of the TEASE trials for Stargardt disease. One of the trials for that treatment, I think it's I don't remember now which one it was. Yeah, so they've actually specifically targeted the younger siblings of older children who've got Stargardt disease, and they're giving them the drug before they've got any symptoms of sight loss, and then they're tracking to see whether that drug would be effective where they know somebody's got the gene, they haven't started to develop sight loss. So you could stop it in its tracks, or certainly slow down the progression of the disease and give somebody good sight for much longer. So I think that is a really exciting potential for if you've got a genetic diagnosis in your family. You could start having treatment even before you have sight loss problems.
Fantastic. And I guess a different question, but still looking at the sort of early stage research. Are there any trials for early stages of dry AMD that you're aware of?
We are starting to see trials addressing people with intermediate AMD. There are some issues. There's a reason why the trials have focused on the late stage of disease. It's about tracking whether the drug is effective or not. In early and intermediate AMD, the sight is pretty good. In intermediate AMD, you may have some trouble seeing at night, but they have to be able to measure something in the trial and show that the drug has had an effect. And in the early and intermediate stages of disease, they've struggled to know what to monitor. They are working on that, and we're starting to see what they call biomarkers that could be used in these earlier stage trials be established. And we are starting to see some of those trials being planned at the intermediate stage. But that is the problem, actually monitoring people and showing an effect of the drug on sight when the sight is still pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. Could the wet AMD treatments on trial also be used for DMO? Someone is suggesting or asking.
Yes, oftentimes the wet AMD drugs are also being looked at for diabetic macular edema as well. I'm not too sure if all of them are, but oftentimes, especially the anti-VEGF therapies are also being tested in diabetic macular edema because they with DMO people are already receiving anti-VEGF therapy as their standard care. So yes, many of the wet AMD treatments are also being tested for DMO.
We've got two questions about gene therapy. So one is asking what stage is gene therapy at for wet AMD? And then someone with a more specific question, which I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but someone is saying they have wet AMD and an interest in gene therapy. They'd spoken to the retina clinic in London, but that was quite a journey for them. They're approached by Trial UK, who asked for their phone number but didn't follow up. And are you aware of who Trial UK are?
No, I don't think I've heard of them.
I'm not familiar with that name.
No, approach with caution. Yeah.
And
Look that one up.
the other question on
Yeah.
what stage gene therapy is at.
Yes, so I mentioned the Ascent and the Artemis trials, which are two gene therapy trials, and they've reached phase 3 and are looking promising. So one of them enables to develop the eyes to make Lucentis, and the other one enables the eyes to make Eylea. And they're both looking quite promising. And as I said, you're doing pretty well if you reach phase 3 on a clinical trial. So real hope for those two.
Yeah, very positive news. About another sort of tracking different research and where it's at. What about the eye drop therapy to treat dry AMD in early stage being developed at Birmingham University? Is that something you're
Yes, so
aware of?
this is a trial. It's not a trial, actually. It's a research project at Birmingham University. It's not reached the stage of a clinical trial yet.
Right.
So I know there's been a lot of interest. We featured that in a couple of appeals, but it's not reached the clinical trial stage yet. Really, I hope that it will get to that stage, but yeah, afraid it's not that stage yet.
Okay, some way off then. You mentioned stable wet AMD, and someone's asking how that decision is made. They have an injection every 9 weeks, so how would you know it was stable?
So with wet AMD, typically people who are receiving wet AMD are on what's referred to as a treat and extend regimen. So they're looking to see how long between injections patients can go. So 9 weeks is fairly stable, but there are people who no longer need injections on a regular basis, but just need to go get monitored to check that there's no more fluid. So that they're no longer receiving any injections, but they're just being monitored to see if fluid reappears. So if you're still receiving injections, you may have stable injections, but you're not inactive stable.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to some sort of broader questions on clinical trials. I think this is an interesting one. How do I know if a clinical trial is safe?
You don't. It's a risk you take when you enter a clinical trial. The treatment is not established as safe until it's been viewed as safe as by the authorities, the MHRA in the UK. So if you enter into a trial, you will have all the risks and potentially the benefits explained to you. And there is a level of, it depends on the trial, but there is a level of acceptance of some degree of risk because this is an experimental drug. So that should be fully explained to you as part of the consenting process. And obviously you're very closely monitored on a clinical trial. Any concerns, you can get straight back to the hospital. They will be very concerned for your safety, but that doesn't mean there isn't a small risk because these are experimental drugs that haven't been proven to be safe yet.
Thank you. You mentioned Tinlarebant. Sorry, I might not be pronouncing that correctly. By Tinlarebant, is it?
Tinlaribant.
Tinlaribant.
That's how I say it. Yeah.
I do love these names. For Stargarts is on the horizon. Is there any further detail on the timeline for that?
It's reached phase 2-3, so we haven't gone through the full set of clinical trials yet. So that one is being, there are sites in the UK for that. So if you're looking to get onto it, I'm happy to provide some more details. But it hasn't reached the end of the phase 3 trials yet. It's still being assessed.
Yeah. Because this is more of a comment than a question, but someone says they've been involved in clinical trials over many years for various illnesses, but now having AMD, their biggest problem is traveling to the location of trials. Therefore, home research is of paramount importance to me. And I think you did talk about some opportunities to get involved in research which can be done by home. Obviously, wouldn't be a clinical trial that would always require some element of travel to a clinic ultimately. But through our clinical trial, for our research participant database, I know people can get involved in lots of other forms of research.
Yep, there's so much more than just being on a clinical trial. We are always being approached by researchers who would like patient involvement in their trial in some way. I mean, that can be really involved, like sort of involved in the management, like by being on what they call a trial steering committee. I'm on a few of those and represent patients, but if patients can devote the time to being very involved in a trial, the researchers would really welcome it. Often there's what's called a PPI group, a patient and public involvement group, that will be associated with the trial and will feed in their comments on the design of the trial, how the results should be reported, as well as the actual patient views as to how the trial is run. So increasingly, researchers are looking to involve patients in trials in all sorts of ways, not just being the guinea pig, so to speak, and testing the treatment.
Yeah. Here's a question which I know lots of people will find challenging. So are most experimental drugs initially tested on animals?
It's very common, unfortunately, that these experimental drugs are tested on animals during the preclinical stage. Now I think there is some interest in using other types of testing, especially the use of stem cells to create other models to test these drugs on before. Unfortunately, as part of that preclinical testing, you need to make sure that any drug that's going to be given to humans is safe. And right now, one of the best ways of doing that is using animals. Because we do want to make sure that before we give that treatment to human, it is not going to be harmful. I think in the US, they're doing a lot of research. The drugs now no longer have to be tested in animals. So that's a really big step forward.
And there's a big focus on reducing, as far as possible, the use of animals in research, and also reducing the any harm and suffering that those animals experience. So it is something that I know, the whole research community clearly doesn't want to see animal research take place, but as you said, it is currently necessary in some ways. Some questions about I guess kind of general progress in research. So are there any new drugs for wet AMD which are available for us now in clinics? It seems everything is work in progress. It's great, which is great, but not helpful for current patients. And obviously we've been focusing on the research underway tonight, but I know there's now quite a range of treatments available.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had several new drugs become available through the NHS for wet AMD. And the newer drugs are pretty effective. There's ones like Vabysmo are becoming well established. The ophthalmologists are learning how to use them and are very happy to use them. So it's great that they have a range of drugs that they can use, because some drugs work better for some people than others. So having a choice of drugs is really helpful for wet AMD treatments, and also for diabetic macular edema or retinal vein occlusion, all the forms of macular disease that can be treated with those anti-VEGF drugs. There will be more new treatments for wet AMD coming through. So do expect to see new treatments like the gene therapy that was mentioned coming through before too long. And
how would you advise someone to go about getting access to one of those newer treatments if that's something they think would be beneficial to them?
Yes, talk to your ophthalmologist. Ask, would I do better on one of these newer treatments? If you're doing fine on the treatment that you're on now, there may be no particular benefit in switching. But if they think you might do better on another drug, they would consider and talk to you about switching. There's some new drugs called biosimilars, which people may be offered. But you should always be asked for your consent if they want to switch drug, and there should always be a good reason. We are starting to see more consistency, I hope, in the future about treatments for people with wet AMD. There's some recent guidance that's been issued by the NHS in England about how this suite of new AMD drugs should be used. Which should be the first one to be used, and then how you would potentially work your way through if, for whatever reason, you needed to switch away from the first choice of treatment.
Yeah, thank you. Someone's asked how they can find out what type of macular disease they have, as they haven't been told, and the consultant used some words they didn't understand but said there wasn't anything they could do to help. What's the best thing to do if you're in that position?
I think the best thing to do is try to go back to speak to a consultant. Maybe try a different consultant if maybe you weren't getting an explanation you understood. Looking at the message, said you got told age-related dry AMD. It's likely you've got the dry form of age-related macular degeneration. With dry AMD, this can be intermediate and early AMD. It also could be referred to as geographic atrophy. So that might be the term you don't recognise. And that's a late stage version of dry AMD. But yes, speaking to the consultant or going to the opticians should give you a bit more clarity and an explanation.
And I know it's difficult, but I'd always encourage people, if a health professional says something you don't understand, absolutely ask them to explain. It's right that they should take the time to make sure you understand what you're being told. Thank you so much. We've answered, I think, a really good range of questions. We've got through as many as we can, but apologies if there's a couple that we've missed along the way. But thank you so much, Sarah and Geraldine, for your time. Really, really interesting talk. Our next webinar will be taking place on the 19th of August at 7 p.m. And actually, this topic links to some of the questions we've had. We'll be welcoming Eleanor Schiff, who is a genetic counsellor at Moorfields Eye Hospital. So she'll be covering the role of genetic counselling and talking about the risks of inheriting macular disease, genetic testing options and implications, and the emotional and psychological impact of genetic information. So really interesting talk coming up. What I'd also like to mention is our Macular Disease Annual Conference will be taking place online on Saturday, the 13th of September, between 9:15 a.m. and 4 p.m. And we'll be joined by a huge range of experts in macular disease, including researchers and clinicians who will discuss the latest in treatments and research. You'll get a chance to ask them your questions in our live Q&A sessions too. The event will also include practical advice on living with macular disease. And to watch online, all you'll need on the day is a computer, tablet or smartphone, and you can also join in using your telephone. You can register online, and I suspect my colleague is just about to share a registration link in the chat, but you can also find it on our website. And I really would encourage anyone with any interest at all in macular disease, whether you're living with it or a loved one does, to join in that conference. It's the best opportunity, I think, to find out everything that's going on in the world of macular research. So thank you again. Yes, and I can see my colleague has shared that link. So please do register. It's completely free and a really, really good day. So thanks again, Sarah, Geraldine. Thank you for everyone for joining us and for all of your questions, and hope to see many of you on the 19th of August. Take care. All the best. Bye.